Welcome to the discussion. My guest today is John DeSimone, the Vice President for Cybersecurity and Special Missions at Raytheon. John, welcome to the discussion.
Thanks for having me.
Let me set some context for our conversation today. Data, the lifeblood of every organization. In fact, research firm IDC predicts the world's data will grow to 175 zettabytes by 2025 from 33 zettabytes in 2018. Now that's a compound annual growth rate of about 61%. Let me put this in perspective. This number, a zettabyte, is a trillion gigabytes, so 175 zettabytes is 175 million gigabytes. It's a lot of data. It's a lot of data, right? The expectation of data growth across the federal government is no different. There are more than 247,000 data sets on data.gov, and that's just one measure. There are zettabytes of data from nearly every agency, from the Census Bureau to NOAA to the Agriculture Department, and it's growing every day, especially as the use of Internet of Things devices, or IoT, continues to grow. And the dependency on data to run missions, to serve citizens, to protect the nation depends on the security and resiliency of that data. Now, there's a lot of discussion today about security, but resiliency is one of those topics that probably doesn't get enough attention. Many times when agencies talk about resiliency, they're thinking of continuity of operations, or COOP. For example, the Office of Management and Budget's 2019 Data Center Memo talks about resiliency of data centers, but really about ensuring agencies know about problems with cooling or power, not about the data itself. And data resiliency for this discussion means something much different. Agencies need to consider an enterprise data management approach that has a command and control approach of sorts on top of it. And as agencies move to a hybrid IT environment where some applications and data are in the cloud, some remain on-premise, the concept of always having access to your data becomes even more important. So how can agencies, if you will, shift that focus even just a little so security also includes a healthy helping of resilience? Well, that's where my guest comes in. Once again, my guest is John DeSimone, the Vice President of Cybersecurity and Special Missions at Raytheon. I tried to outline it at a very high level, but let's get into the weeds a little bit. Data resiliency, why is it important, John?
Well, data resiliency is extremely important for enterprises because data is really, it's obviously the electronic or digital version of the information that enterprises use to run their businesses and make decisions. So without protection of that information, the ability to make decisions or understand what's going on in the environment or to recover to provide services becomes extremely impacted.
But it's more than just security, because and I think that was a point that I think people lose is, yes, you can put the moat and the big wall or endpoint, but it's the resiliency piece is really what we're talking about here is if something happens, can you bounce back?
Correct. Data resiliency obviously means, can your data withstand an attack? I mean, it also relates to the things that you'd mentioned earlier. I mean, you do have to have disaster recovery, business continuity, business resumption plans in place so that if your data center goes down, obviously there's data contained in that data center, it needs to come back up. But it also is a shift towards monitoring, doing the orchestration, understanding the collection, the creation, the classification of your data, and being able to watch that flow through your organization. Much like today, security systems tend to watch network traffic and network flow. We've got to move to an environment where you're actually watching the data flow and understanding the impacts that different systems and users have on that data.
And when you talk about the data flow, that's, I'm in the field, I'm working for USDA, I'm collecting, how much soybeans I'm growing, and I send that data back to USDA as a report. That is part of that data flow.
Yes, but even look higher. In other words, if you think about the life cycle of the data, an object, whether from a creation, modification, transmission, classification, storage, archive, all aspects of data in its life cycle, which would occur in things that you just mentioned, whether someone's collecting information on the field, but it's really understanding how from inception to really destruction, how you manage and orchestrate and understand the data in your environment.
We see a lot from this administration around data. We see a data strategy. We have a bill that's passed by Congress to create chief data officers. Kind of a new trend, if not something that's been around, but starting to pick up some steam. Do agencies get what data resiliency is and why it's important?
I think it depends on agency to agency. I think some absolutely get it, and some have been collecting and dealing with data for years, and now they're dealing with kind of the volumes that you mentioned earlier in the segment. Of what to do with it, how to manage it, and how to make sure you can make decisions on it. Others are entering into that early phase, but I think everybody understands with whether it's an attack that's in the news or whether it's a server that's gone down, that the backups weren't properly done, so now your emissions impacted. I think everybody understands the value.
And I mentioned in the beginning about this hybrid IT environment, some in the cloud, some not in the cloud. Does that make resiliency from a definition perspective, from an understanding perspective, a little easier? Because it's not everything's in your data center, but you could have a version in your data center, you could have a version in the cloud, and you could have that version in multiple clouds.
Yeah, it definitely makes the ability to provide that resiliency easier. It just gives you more options and more tools, if you will, in your toolbox. But in and of itself, they're not going to provide you data resilience. You still have to put the orchestration across your enterprise to manage the data, to make sure you understand. Because having it in one area or one cloud is meaningful, but to understand the uptime, the resiliency of that cloud itself, and how important that data is, and do you have a secondary storage unit, and those things are just as critical.
Is that the key word to this orchestration? It's less about, hey, this data lives somewhere, but again, you went through all the different stages of data. So is how you orchestrate, how you manage.
Absolutely, I think that's the key. Having the tools and being able to encrypt obviously are going to be critical. Being able to classify are going to be critical. But tying it all together in a command and control environment and orchestrating it across the enterprise is really the next step.
How does that work? Walk me through what's an approach may look like for orchestration of data.
Well, you can imagine in other orchestration, and it's not a new approach to do orchestration, but what you would need to have is you would need to have architecture in your environment to provide zero trust, so that you understand at each step the integrity of data, whether it's being run on the appropriate servers, whether it's being run by the appropriate people. So you do have to have what they call bindings of users to equipment and equipment to data, so that you can trust it as it orchestrates through the step and through the enterprise. And then once you have that, now you just need to have a tool in place that you can look at your data in an enterprise view as it flows through your network and as it gets stored in your data centers.
You mentioned zero trust, but I was a little surprised you didn't mention blockchain. Now I know everyone, the buzzwords in the federal sector everyone loves to mention, but this sounds like the way you're saying, trust your data, trust integrity of the data. It seems like that's a perfect fit for blockchain. In fact, I just did a recent story with the Department of Health and Human Services where they're applying that technology to their procurement data. So anytime anyone touches it, it changes. Is that not just blockchain, but that concept of understanding who's using your data, how they're using it, what changes are made? That is part of this resiliency piece, because you can always, okay, John touched it, John messed it up. How can we go back one step so we can go back toward before John messed it up?
Yeah, I mean, blockchain can be a tool that can be used in it. I wouldn't lock them synonymously with zero trust, but absolutely, if you can understand and you can monitor each step in the process, and you could validate trust as every operation is being done on the data within your enterprise. Now, do you have the ability to roll back or audit? There's a lot more to it, but the first step is to understand if you have trust in each step, validating it, and then when you identify something that's an issue, what is your resiliency and your recoup plan and your availability to come back online?
When we talk about zero trust, it's clear that it's a framework. It's not necessarily a new technology, or you won't put in your zero trust. It's a bunch of technologies, but it's also, when we talk data resiliency, and I mentioned in the beginning, we focused on cybersecurity, protecting the data, but not necessarily making it resilient. Walk me through a little bit of how the two go hand in hand, meaning cyber and data resiliency.
Well, cyber is obviously a very ubiquitous term. It's very horizontal in nature. So, it's going to encompass a lot of things. I mean, today, cyber defense systems usually are focused on, either the malicious piece of code that someone inadvertently or intentionally, downloaded into the network and it's exfilling data, or, some kind of network or anomaly or traffic that's coming in that shows that there's some form of virus. That's the way most cyber defense systems are set up today, looking for those types of detection. When you roll into data resiliency and you go into zero trust, you're not going to stop doing those things. But what you're going to do is add a verification at each step, so not just at the endpoint where you're doing authentication to the system, but as data is flowing through, you're going to validate trust on every action that's taking place on that data, and you're going to use a set of dynamic variables to identify that trust. The user, the time, the work patterns that the type of information they're looking at, to kind of correlate to say, should this action be taken and is it valid? And if it is, let it pass. If it's not, you kind of stop it right there. So you get a higher degree of ability to protect yourself. And that goes back to being able to collect the tools that are, or the information and sensors that are in place today, but add an orchestration layer around the data to take use of those and to monitor it and apply it to how data flows.
Do you guys have customers right now that you can talk to, not classified, of course, that maybe are starting down this path of creating that type of environment that is not just zero trust, but adding that data resiliency?
We do have customers. I mean, obviously, I can't go into the who's, but there is a lot of our customers are looking at it, and as I said earlier, have looked at the need for data resiliency and are trying to tackle this problem and in a zero trust environment.
And do they get the fact that it's not just security is important, but it's be able to look at that life cycle of the data, understand where it's created, where it moves, who's using it, when they're using it? Like, is that something that the government, generally speaking, and I know every agency is a little different, is really putting their head around? Because again, when I go to events, when I sit in panels and watch CIOs talk, this topic doesn't really come up. Security, but not resiliency.
Yeah, I do think they get it. I think, but in a problem or a problem so big, right? And you think about the solutions that we have and need to have in place to make this work. I think they do get it, and I think they do understand it, and I think they're trying to figure out what's the right stepping stone to get there. So what system has to go in place? For instance, do you implement the root of trust at the endpoints first, establish that, then move to the next layer? Because it will take, it won't be one major system. It will be a combination of different products and architectures that come into play to provide that data resiliency.
And that goes back to the zero trust discussion. Same concept. There's no magic zero trust bullet.
There's no magic zero trust bullet.
One of the interesting things about this that you brought up was this concept of understanding the who and the what, but also the where, like where does it live? And that takes us down the path of cloud. It takes us back of on-premise and the hybrid environment. Is data resiliency any different, or does it cause any more? Do agencies have to think differently about whether they're in the cloud mostly, or whether they're on-prem mostly, or vice versa?
You know, I think not as far as orchestration. I mean, obviously you think differently about where you would like your data to reside or live, and you can use general characteristics of how you're trying to access it, maybe speed, bandwidth to actually access it, whether it's local from a port or in the cloud. But I think in general, the world's gotten so flat, especially in the IT, you have to have the same tools that can apply whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. If you don't, you're probably leaving yourself a little vulnerable.
I think that's a really important point. The tools have to be integrated no matter where you're at. And so many times people want to buy a tool for a specific problem, but not really understand, well, how does it work on-prem versus in cloud, or in mobile or other ways. And actually mobility is another area maybe we can touch upon after the break. But give me a sense when you talk to agencies about this data resiliency effort, where are they in the overall scheme of things from okay, we understand it, we have this concept of the data strategy, we're putting chief data officers in place, OMB has told us about high value data assets. Are they starting with those high value assets? Are they starting somewhere else? Do you get a sense?
Well, yeah, so in general, I'd say, there's still, all the agencies are fighting the good fight. So you still have the battle that's raging about protecting your assets in places as it is today, making sure you're patching your system. So there's still that battle that's raging on that you can't take focus off. You have to figure out how to do data resiliency as you're fighting the fight today, and then move into data resiliency. And I think as they're looking at that, they're starting to determine, again, what the next step is, what's the path, how do they build upon what they're currently doing to start to take that step. And absolutely, at least for all the agencies that we're dealing with, data, the amount of data, the correlation of it, being able to use it for different types of decision making, trying to get it to feed AI, ML engines is absolutely on the minds of every agency that we deal with.
All right, you hit upon some other things we're going to talk about in the next segment. Let's take a quick break. You're listening to Every Side of Cyber, Data Protection with Zero Trust, sponsored by Raytheon on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.